Welcome. Hi, I'm Dawn with K-Squared Technologies. Welcome to our monthly webinar training series. Today's session is on Microsoft Excel pivot tables. We encourage you to be actively involved in our training in Excel, so please share your questions through the Q&A feature. You're welcome to ask questions throughout the training. And we'll reserve chat for just general communications for today's training. I want to just get an idea from you in terms of what your experience is with Excel pivot tables specifically. And so I'll bring up a poll here, and I'd just like to have you hop in and let me know where you're at. There is any answer is a good answer. And just take a moment to let me know if you're brand new with pivot tables, or maybe you are on that scale of having quite a bit of experience with pivot tables. So let's see where you're at. Excellent. All right. So let's go ahead and get a sense of where everyone is. And as I mentioned, there's no wrong answer. As you can see, many of you joined because you haven't worked with pivot tables, or you'd like to learn to know how to use them more effectively. And so with those answers, excellent. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to find out where you're at. And we'll go ahead and start our journey in exploring Excel pivot tables. So what we're going to be covering here in the next hour is, first of all, and especially for those of you that are brand new to pivot tables, this will be especially helpful for you. We want to build the foundation. Is how do you create and modify pivot tables, and even what are they, right? And then how can we format? What are our options for formatting pivot tables? Sorting and filtering data, summarizing, calculating, and as time allows, we'll explore creating pivot charts. A good thing to keep in mind is that the recording for this session will be available afterwards. So feel free to take notes, but know that you can go back to it as well to review. And that can be helpful, as we'll keep up a fairly good pace on this, just so that we can cover as much as possible and really give you a full view of what's possible with Excel pivot tables. So one of the first things to know is, if you are successfully working with the sorting and filtering features in Excel, then your data is likely ready for pivot tables. But it's good to look at it to see. That is, just like with sorting and filtering, we want our data to be organized in rows and columns, and you don't want to have any blank rows or columns. So if you happen to have some introductory text at the top, for instance, then one of the things that you want to be really watchful of is to have at least one blank row in that structure. And this is pretty straightforward, but want to make sure that we cover that. And then you have similar data in each column, but you may have to rework the data. So for instance, if you have a category that you're using to qualify things, that would be better in one column rather than to have 5 different columns for each of those circumstances. That is, as you'll see, pivot tables are a way for us to summarize and collect data in a way that might be more challenging if it's in a standard worksheet, or if we're only applying sorting and filtering features. Ideally, we want unique column headings. And if those column headings are formatted differently than the data, then it's easier for Excel to recognize what are the data and what's the headings. And so this also applies with sorting and filtering. And when I say formatted differently, that could just mean that you are looking at something that is simply bold or centered. It doesn't have to be fancy. Why this is helpful is that then you don't have to highlight the data all ahead of time. And because that can be very cumbersome if you have hundreds or thousands of rows of information. If it's formatted correctly, then you can just be in a cell in the data, and Excel will be able to reach out and know what that range of data might be. So that is also helpful for the success of your pivot tables as well as your sorting and filtering features. So essentially what we want to do is create an island of data. That is, it stands alone and it doesn't have anything else that gets in its way. So that's the basic idea that we have in terms of how we prepare the data. Now, as you'll see, once we get into the pivot table structure, the whole concept of it, and one of the reasons why we hear that, why it's called pivot table, is we could actually, and I know you've probably heard the word pivot a lot in the last year, but this is different. This means that we can take what might be different columns of different data and actually turn that data on its side so that we can do comparisons. Now, a simple pivot table might just have two elements, rows and values that were something we want to quantify. There are four quadrants, as you'll see in our pivot tables. So rows, values, columns, and report filter. You don't have to use all of them, but they are available to you as you build the structure of your pivot table. And you're going to see all of this hands-on. But want to give you some of that terminology as we continue and as we start working with it. So that's the basic idea of what you're going to see. But we want to be able to make this easier for you, not just conceptually, but for you to see it live. So let's go ahead and actually start our exploration of pivot tables in Excel. This is an example of data that we could use for pivot tables. Now, in this case, the column headings are on row 1. Don't have to be, as I mentioned, as long as you would have at least one blank row separating that from any other content at the top. And we can have blank cells, but we don't want to have any blank rows. In this case, I'll simply click into the data, don't have to highlight it ahead of time, and we're going to create a pivot table. And we do this and find this action under Insert. And in Insert, then we have the option here for Pivot Table. Now, I'll just mention here that once you get comfortable and once you get started with pivot tables, there's also an option for recommended pivot tables. This is something that I suggest that you explore once you already are familiar with the concepts. That is, what this does is it can give you suggestions based upon the structure of your data that you could pick from. And so it could be very helpful. But I want you to be able to create pivot tables from scratch. So let's explore what that looks like. In this case, I'll simply choose Pivot Table here. And you will see then the Create dialog box is displayed. Now, this is why we wanted to have the data prepared correctly, because notice on the boundaries of the data that we have what I call the dancing ants. It's just a marquee. That is, you'll see these moving dash lines that are indicating what Excel believes is the data that you're working with. And if this was a range name, if you have this formatted as a table that has a range name, even if it's just table 1, then that even improves than working with pivot tables. But in this case, this is a physical range here. And that is correct for this particular sample. And where do you want to put pivot table? Well, I'm going to put it into a new worksheet. Know that you can have more than one pivot table on the same data because we might be asking different questions about the data. So that's also handy as well. In this case, I'll go ahead and choose OK. And now we are not only, we are in the pivot table design area, if you want to think of it that way. That is, we're in a new worksheet, currently sheet 1, and we can start building this pivot table. Now, of course, just randomly adding fields won't get you very far with this. And so we still want to look at, say, what is our end result? What do we want to accomplish here? And in this case, I'd like to summarize the information by the region. So on the right-hand side, here are pivot table fields. And in the bottom half, these are the 4 areas where we will see these fields displayed. First, I'll simply click on region. So notice that just with one click, we have an alphabetized list of all of the different occurrences for region. That alone can be really handy, something that can sometimes take a lot of time for us if we're just trying to sort and filter to extract the same thing. And what I want to see from this are the totals, in this case, sales totals. So I'll click on totals. And once again, then in just a couple clicks, we now have a summarized look at the current information. And that alone can be one of the reasons why pivot tables can be so helpful. Now, you are welcome to jump into chat anytime and say things like, wow, that's amazing, awesome, this is going to save you so much time, whatever will be helpful for you. I'm going to zoom in here just a little bit so you can see this content a bit clearer. Now, notice on the bottom right-hand side here, region dropped into rows, and totals, because it has a numeric value, moved into values. We not only can sum, but we could count our records. We could average, get a maximum. So there's other kinds of questions that we can have of this data. But this alone, this might be something that helps you get those end results. That is what you're looking for here. Let's make this a little bit more helpful to us. And so one of the options that we have here is, you might notice, and this is a common question I get, that the totals do not have the same formatting as the original data. I'll move back to this, which was my sales tracking worksheet. So these were formatted with the accounting format. And in this case, we just have a general format. It might be very tempting to move to the Home tab or to highlight all of these and to format it in this way. But sometimes when we refresh or update the information, then this will, it will revert back, or it won't be consistent formatting. So here's the easiest thing to do. And it's also good to know that you don't have to use the same formatting as you have in your data source. And that is also actually helpful and flexible. So for this one, I'll right click and I can simply choose number format. Notice I didn't even select all those cells. The number format's being applied to the values. And from here, I'll choose that accounting format with 0 decimal places, but we could pick something else as well. And now those values are displayed a little differently. So that gives us some really easy flexibility as well with the pivot tables. When we're in the pivot table, I'd also like to have you notice here that we have some contextual ribbon tabs, meaning that they are only available when we're in the pivot table. And here is the Analyze ribbon tab and Design. So these will both be helpful for us, and we'll explore some of the choices within that. But already with just a few clicks, you might have something that would otherwise be cumbersome for you to build if you were just working with your data directly. And this is the idea of a pivot table. Now, there's certainly a lot more that we can do for this. And so let's explore how we can add more answers to this and look at the data a little differently. What if I'd also like to break this out by the different locations? Well, all I'm going to do for that is just pick here, location. And now my data is broken out in this way. So that becomes then another way to summarize our information in an easy way. Imagine if that original data wasn't just 74 records, for instance, or 73 records, but 7,400. And now we're able to see it then broken out in this manner. So all of that is displayed over on the right-hand side in our pivot table fields. Please do check in and offer your questions, or let me know if there's anything you'd like to have some clarification on. That is, this is your training and we want to make this really valuable for you. So that becomes another way for us to look at this information. Now, another way to look at it, let's say I'll uncheck the location here for a minute and pick instead department. And so now I have this broken out by department. Now I could look at this a little differently. In the rows, and you can rearrange these. If for instance, department, you'd rather see department above the region, if it makes more sense for the information, look for the four-headed arrow and I could drag that up. And now we have a breakout by department first and then the region. But instead, I'm dragging that over to the columns. And you see that when I drop that, now we have a different picture. And this is where the concept of the pivot comes from. As we actually turn that was just one of our columns, and we turn that data on its side so that we could see this information in a more useful way. I'm often asked as well as about these column labels. You can either choose not to display them, or you can rename them as long as you don't use a field name. So I could label that, department, spell that out. Or if I don't want to see that, notice here on the right-hand side of the ribbon, here we have options that we can turn on or off. So if I didn't want to see the field headers, I just click that and it's no longer displayed. So that becomes another option for us as well. In this case, at least for right now, I'll uncheck the department and add the location back in. Okay. And actually, I do want to have that department there. So I'll drag that back up into the columns. So look at the flexibility that we have here. I have it broken out by the locations and the departments, and we are seeing grand totals. Those are optional, but we also have the subtotals. So in chat, let me know and you can direct that for everyone to see if you'd like to. What do you think about pivot tables so far? Useful? Something you might be able to start working with? Just let us know. Is this something that will be handy for you with what you've seen so far? Okay. Let's go ahead then, and I'm seeing some answers coming in. Just the panelists, you're welcome to direct those to other people, but I'm glad that this is something that's helpful for you as well. All right, now here's one, I would say the most important thing for you to know about pivot tables, and that is about refresh. I hope you take away a number of handy tips with this, but if nothing else, you want to know about refresh. Because when we're working with Excel, we become accustomed to the fact that if the data changes, then our totals automatically update. They are refreshed. And it doesn't work that way with pivot tables. So that is something we have to kind of relearn. What I mean by that is, let's say, for instance, we have here our Cleveland gadgets. And that total is summarized right now to be a little over 38,000. So with that one, if I go back to my original sales tracking, that's the worksheet that this came from. Here's my Cleveland gadgets, and I might have multiple rows that contribute to that. So know that that's one of the real advantages here. But I'm going to change this to be a much larger number now. And the other thing about this is I don't have to know what changed. It's just that as I work with that data, or someone else, maybe other people on my team are working with it, then this data might change. So I've increased this, and I would expect that to update. Now, the other thing too is, let's say, for instance, that we have had a little bit of change in terms of territory, for instance. And so this person has now moved to Cleveland as well. So their data should also be included. Move back to that pivot table and no change. And as I mentioned, I don't have to know where the changes were, but it is good if you use pivot tables, or if you are starting to see some applications for it, that you definitely want to add this refresh process as part of how you work with them. So let's explore what that means. And I'll click away from the Cleveland gadgets just so you know that it doesn't matter where I'm at. Under the analyze, that is before we can rely on this, we might say, oh, this is really handy for me. We go to the pivot table analyze, and here is refresh. That is before we commit to this, share it, print it, anything like that, make decisions upon that data. We have refresh, which is Alt F5, and refresh all. The advantage of refresh all is if there are other pivot tables based upon our data source, that it will also refresh those. So we're going to, well, in this case, I'm going to refresh all, and notice what happened now. My Cleveland gadgets updated. I don't have them for this particular location for Memphis. And I now have updated information based upon the current data. So that is something that you definitely want to make a note of, just to ensure that you are getting the correct information and making the correct decisions. A couple other quick things about this, and then I'll show you some other possibilities in working with pivot tables. First of all, it's helpful to also know how to change the data source. And so if you've added additional rows since you first created your pivot tables, or you just want to confirm that you're inclusive of everything, that's also under the Analyze tab here under Change Data Source. And with this, we can go ahead and change this, or simply confirm that it's working correctly for us, that it's picking up on the right range. And that can then be adjusted should we need to. The other thing that can be handy is, think about those times when you perhaps wanted to extract just certain records from a worksheet. In those cases, maybe, there might be different strategies for that, but often it's that we make a copy of the worksheet, then we delete all the ones that aren't the ones we want, or we copy and paste what we want. And it often has multiple steps, and it can be time consuming. So here's another advantage of a pivot table, and really just a handy trick. I want to see, or maybe my manager is asking me, or the executive team is asking me, well, where did that Chicago figure looks a little high? Where did that come from? So I can simply go to those values and double click. And I now have a brand new worksheet, it's part of the same workbook, that has extracted those records in, I can see exactly the detail. Now, this is not linked to the original data, so know that that's one of the things to keep in mind. But then if I wanted to, pardon me, copy or move this to another worksheet or another workbook, I could. So a really handy thing to keep in mind as well, that this becomes a way for us to extract that data. And hopefully this is starting to give you some ideas. Let's look at some other possibilities in terms of working with the pivot table. Notice in this case, because we have multiple levels, we have the region and then the location, that we also now see these little indicators here for expanding or collapsing. And in this case, then if I wanted to just collapse for the East region, click on the minus. You're probably familiar with that, or you've seen that, let's say, in working with Windows Explorer or perhaps other applications. Then in that case, then I could also expand that. But let's go take that a little further. Back in the Analyze tab here, it can be on any one of these regions options. And here we see, and it might look a little different on your screen, certainly, just all depends upon resolution here. And I'm going to collapse this field. So now we have it more of an executive level look. I still see those numbers, the details available. If I am responsible for or want to see what the West looks like, I could go ahead and click on that and I could see that detail. So there's a lot of flexibility here to either expand. In this case, I'll expand or collapse. So explore those as well. Know that your data, we could take this pivot table, we could select it, Control A to select it, copy it, and we could paste it into another workbook or paste it into another worksheet. Now, once again, it doesn't have any links then. It's no longer a pivot table in that case, but it is something that becomes available for us to be able to work with that data in whatever way we might want. So it's just to have that flexibility of using it in this way. Another thing to keep in mind, another thing that can be helpful for us is once you start building pivot tables, we also have a design tab. So the design tab has some additional features, not something that we have to necessarily change in any way, but it can be helpful to look at that. So first of all, on the left-hand side, subtotals. Do you want them? Where do you, maybe you want them at the bottom of the group rather than the top of the group. How do you want to handle your grand totals? So explore these as well. The report layout right now is what's called compact form. And that's probably works just fine for most of us, but we could go to the outline form or pick something else. Notice you could repeat all those item labels in that case. Here, I'll move back to the compact form. And although we wouldn't want blank rows and data that we are sorting or filtering or using for pivot tables, we can actually insert blank lines in the pivot table and have it still work successfully. So that becomes another option as well. Additionally, there are pivot table styles. This is a fairly simple style. You could pick some others as well and explore those options as well. Excellent. So that's the idea of a pivot table. Let's look at some other options for you. All right. Sorting and filtering. What are those possibilities? Well, once again, here we are looking at our data. We created this pivot table from sales tracking. And for right now, I'll uncheck the regions. So now I'm just looking at the data by location and broken out by the departments. And please do share your comments and your questions as well. If you have specific questions, you can drop those into the Q&A feature. If there's something that you're seeing that was helpful for you, please do share that in chat. It's always good to know what is valuable for you. And in this case now, you might notice then that it's sorted by the locations. That's the default by whatever happens to be in those rows. But you might want to look at the data in a little different way. So perhaps we're in our total here and we'd like to see it sorted by the total, maybe from lowest to highest. You can simply right click. Here is sort, and we can change the sort order. So now we're simply selecting a different order for this information. That's also available to us in our drop down here. So this is for my row labels. That becomes another way, and you'll see as well, this is how we could filter. So we have the option to be able to filter or to choose different choices there. You are also welcome, if you're familiar with these features, under the Data tab for sorting and filtering, you would also have the ability to then choose, for instance, your sort options and the sort dialog box. So notice this gives us a little bit different select list of choices when we're working with the pivot table. So in this case, then it could be left to right, smallest to largest, left to right, if that was how I wanted to work with it. And let me come into a different option here. I'll go ahead and resort this alphabetically so you can see it a little differently. All right. So now I'll come back to that sort again and sort from smallest to largest, left to right. And it actually changed the order of the departments in doing that. A lot of different choices for you. That is, how do you want to see that information? How will it help you to make decisions? All of those things can be helpful. Another option that we explored with that is that we could do a filter. And so in this case, I'm going to go ahead and bring back the region. And that's not really helpful. I selected that. Seems that spring and allergies are kicking in for me. So thanks for your patience on that. In this case, I want to take that region and drag it once again above the location. There we go. And now what I'd like to do, notice this drop down here. And in fact, we'll go ahead and we'll look at this one. I'll go to the drop down here, and maybe all I want to do is just look at east and west. And so now we're filtering it. Now we see the data focusing on whatever fields are most important to us. What questions do we want to have answered? Now we could view this information in a little different way. Go ahead and go back to the filter here. I'll clear the filter from region. And I had a question come in, and yes, the recording will be made available later after this session. So that will be a great reference for you. I'm going to take this region and drag it up into what's called the report filter. So notice that's one of our 4 areas. And this is then the report filter location in the upper left-hand corner. So in this case now, this becomes a different way to filter. We could once again go to the drop down. I could pick a specific location. That might be one different region. And that works pretty well. Here's where we run into a challenge. Let's say instead I want to select multiple items. So we'll go ahead and do that. And now I want Southeast and Southwest. And I have that, or at least I think I do. But notice that the region just says multiple items. That isn't as clear as it could be. It works, and it's certainly an option for you to add that report filter. Here's one of the things that can be really helpful for you. And that is something called a slicer. So this is also going to be really useful for you. Instead of having the region in the report filter, I'll unselect it. So once again, we have all of our data summarized by the location and the department. But this time we're adding a slicer. So I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. So this will be a little easier to see. A slicer is used for filtering. We find it under Analyze. And in Analyze then is Insert Slicer. So this is a way for you to create a dashboard. Think about your, executive team, or maybe it's something you want to have for yourself. And you could insert the slicer. I'll just pick region, but notice every single field is available. We could have multiple slicers, really interactive dashboard for us. In this case, I'll go ahead and OK. And now you see a slicer. And it remembers the last filter that we had before. Now I'm going to go ahead and clear that. That's the option here in the corner. This then is a great way to really be able to clearly see how you want to filter this information by creating a slicer. And so by simply selecting, you want more than one, hold Control. So I'll hold Control to select more than one. But notice how visually now we're able to see this. And you could drag this and size this. You can move it around. There's also a ribbon tab just for the slicer. This gives you the ability to change then the style. You can change the dimensions of it. How handy is that? This is one of the most popular pieces of pivot tables because it's visual and it makes it really easy for us to be able to filter our information, and we can always clear at any time. So this is also another way for us to do a multiple select. We can enable that instead of using the Control key. So you can try that too. So a slicer, excellent way for us to be able to really look at this data in a useful way. Please continue to share your questions, or, if you think like slicer is awesome, put that, drop that into chat. Let's look at something as well that might, another way for us to leverage pivot tables. Here we have sales by order date. Now this is working off of a fairly complex set of data. So this happens to be, over 1,200 rows. That's could be 12,000. That's possible. But we have individual dates, and you might be looking at transactions. How do you quantify those? It isn't always helpful to have it by every single date if you really want to see what happens by month or happens by year. And so this is a pivot table that was created where the order date was was added to the rows. And notice what happens. Excel automatically adds quarters and years to that pivot table. It isn't something you even have to tell it to do. So notice that these are expandable. It can be a much easier way for us to look at our information. And we would be able to further modify this. But that's the idea as well, if you're working with dates, that we also can see this information in a useful way. So what about filtering dates? That's something called a timeline. A timeline. How we build that is it's under the Analyze tab, and here is Insert Timeline. And any dates that are available, in this case, it's only the order date, but you might have more than one. And now look at this. Just like the slicer, you can size this. You could change the formatting of it. It has its own formatting or own ribbon tab for this. But how does this work for us? Well, all we have to do then is we can come to the edge of this timeline, and maybe I want to see, maybe your fiscal year is July. You start new year, July 1. Okay. And you'd like to see then this data through June. So we could then take this and drag that timeline. And as we drag the timeline, notice the data here. As I drag the timeline in or out, my results change. We also can view this information. Notice it's telling us this is what we're seeing here, what that time frame is. We could view this by quarters. That would be another way to do it. We could view it by years. We could view it by months, which is what we had, or even days. How would this be helpful for you? So timelines, another option for you. Here you see an example of that same data with a filter, but you could have a timeline and a slicer. You could have a timeline and a slicer for the same set of data and use both of those as a dashboard, as a way to interact with your data. And I hope that's giving you as well some different options. Now, although it's not apparent with us, you would have the ability, and you could either insert some additional rows, or you could change the height of these top rows. So we could build a space so that this timeline and or the slicer could be at the top of your pivot table, and that would be another way to interact with it. So explore that for your data. Explore what would be helpful for you. What information would be helpful? All right. Want to also share with you some options for summarizing and calculating. I hope you've already have some great tips and some, most of you said that you hadn't used pivot tables at all. So if nothing else, I hope that through this training, you'll see that this might be a great solution for some of your data. And if you've had a little bit of experience with them or more, that you have even more choices in terms of how you might work with them. So this is a simple worksheet, pivot table that is built off of that sales tracking. It's just broken out by the departments. And what we're going to look at here is that I'd like to be able to, I'm just saying broken out by the departments, and I have the totals. What if I want to see a little bit more information from this? Well, what I'm going to do here for summarizing it is it defaulted here to giving me the sum of the totals. That's absolutely might be all I need. But I'd also like to find out how many transactions I have. So here's the trick. I'll go over to the totals in the field list, and I'm going to drag down a copy that is simply going to drag this down into values. So notice how that is just in values. I'll let go. And now we get another copy. But I want to change that. Now I can change that in a couple ways. I can go to the drop down here and choose value field settings, or I can right click on this, value field settings. It takes me to the same place. So what do I want to call this? Well, and I can always change this, hopefully. Especially if the keyboard decides it's going to be a little wonky for me, but there we go. We'll just keep this simple. There we go. Number of transactions. There we go. Now it decided to wake up. It needed a little coffee apparently. But I can change this to count. Whoops, and I shouldn't have changed the label there first. So I'm going to change that to count. I think we're going to be good with count. Only because I don't want to spend all the time working with the keyboard on this one. So here's the count. Now I'll simply choose OK. So now we have the count. We know how many transactions we have and the sum by simply making a copy of that field. So that is another piece that can also be really handy for you. A way for you to summarize, a way for you to calculate by simply making a copy of that field. And I hope that's giving you some ideas with that. And as you saw, yes, you normally can go in there and rename those as well. But that becomes a really helpful option for you as well. Now, what if we want to look at this a little differently? For this one, I'll go ahead and remove this field, the count, and I can just look at the drop down and choose remove and show you another option. Maybe I want to do some projections for the coming year. I want to see whether it's an increase in profit or an increase in cost or something along those lines. So I'll show you how you can build a calculated field. Where people make mistake in Excel is moving to the right of this data, moving outside of the pivot table. And notice, by the way, this is also a question I hear quite often. When I'm in the pivot table, now I see the pivot table fields. The ribbon and that list will go away when you click away from the pivot table. So that's why it disappears. The mistake is often moving to the right here and trying to do a calculation. Instead, we want to build the calculations into the pivot table. And so that is what we're going to do. To start this, it's under the Analyze tab, Fields, Items, and Sets. And it's a calculated field. Now, what do I want to build here? This could be a calculation of multiple fields in the data. For this one, I'll call this projection. And it's going to be equal to my totals. I'll simply double click or insert times. I want to see what happens if there's an increase of 5%. So I've given it the calculation. I could, if it made sense, I could have multiple fields that are added together or multiplied. I'll add this in. I have now created a new field called projection. Now that field is only in this pivot table. And OK. So once again, we could relabel these, but this might be my projection for the coming year. That's the idea of building a calculation. That is, you build it within the pivot table itself. If I no longer need that, I can uncheck. The thing to keep in mind is that you can always take an existing pivot table and make a copy of it like you could with other worksheets. Some of you may be familiar with that. I'll show that to you really quick. I'll show you in one more way to create a custom calculation, and then we'll wrap up with PivotCharts. So I hope that you have already have some highlights from this and that ways that you are going to be able to use the pivot table. If I wanted to make a copy of this worksheet, it is a pivot table right now. I'll simply, now some of you may know if I right click, you can move or copy. You can absolutely do that. So that certainly is an option to make a copy of it in the same workbook. My trick is that instead of just dragging this to move, I'll use my mouse on it, hold down the control key, and now I'm holding control. My mouse has a page with a plus. When I let go of the mouse, I have an exact copy of that pivot table. And so in this case, I could double click on that, rename that, And I have another pivot table that's all, they're both based upon that original data. We always want to make sure that we're aware as well, once again, with a refresh. So I'm going to add to this another field. Once again, I'm going to drag a copy of that total. Last time we used it for a count. This time I'll use it for a little different calculation. And I'll right click. Here I have value field settings. So once again, I'm going through this fairly quickly, but know you have that recording available to you. Last time we used sum, I used count. And you can see there's other things like max, average, and so on. Here I want to show the values as, and under the dropdown, percentage of column total. Explore that there are a lot of other possibilities here as well. I just want to see how this breaks out, because maybe it's not 4 departments, it's 20 different categories that I'm trying to analyze. You can give this a custom name and choose OK. So now I see that breakout. Once again, something that could be time consuming or difficult if I was trying to do it manually. That is the idea of creating pivot tables. We saw how to add slicers and timelines. You've seen how to do calculations, how to summarize, filtering and sorting. And now we're going to wrap up with a look at pivot charts. Pivot charts utilize the same type of options that we would have with regular charts, but they're based upon a pivot table. So in this case, we already have a pivot table created. Another little trick in Excel, if I move to those triangles in the bottom left-hand corner and right click, here I can see all of my available worksheets. And the one I want to show you is Greenwood Sales. That's near the end. So that can be handy when you have a workbook that has a lot of different worksheets. Just have some different products in it. And those products have been summarized in a pivot table called products. Here again, broken out by the different kinds of products and then the locations. I'll add a chart here so this becomes a little bit more interactive for me, a little bit easier to work with. And in this case, all we need to do is under the pivot table analyze, here on the right-hand side, pivot chart. What kind of chart do you want? All the same options we would have if we were just in a worksheet. For this, for time's sake, I'll choose the column and choose OK. And I now have a chart of this data. We can move it anywhere we want, to the right, to the bottom. In this case, I'll put it on the right-hand side. And this is based upon the data. So if the data is filtered, if the data changes, then so would my chart. Now we could filter it here. You can see the filters by the different products. That would be an option. Or by the regions. So that's where we see that by these axes and by the legend. That becomes one option for it. And so if we only want to see east and west, now the data in the pivot table changes and it changes in the pivot chart. So these are interactive and they're part of it. As we saw before, we could also add a slicer. Maybe I'll add a slicer here for the region. That becomes a different way to interact with it. These could be positioned wherever it makes sense. I'll put it at the bottom just so we can see this. And here again, I pick East. My data is filtered by East. My pivot chart is also showing that as well. So it becomes another way for us to create this interactive way for our users to work with our pivot tables and for us to really get the answers that we're hoping for. As with all of the other tools, the slicer has its own ribbon. The chart itself has its own different tabs, design and format. So those are available to us. A lot of different choices for us to be able to work effectively with pivot tables. I hope that has given you lots of excitement about working with pivot tables. I encourage you just to take a moment on your own and maybe write down some of those takeaways. What are those highlights? What are some of the things that you want to go back and try? How are you going to use pivot tables for you to be able to effectively use Excel and really get the answers that you need? So definitely take a moment to recap for yourself and know that we have that available as a review. As you know, we have these K-Squared Technologies webinars offered once a month on the second Tuesday of each month. And what we have coming up is working with Microsoft Forms. That is part of Microsoft 365. And then we'll explore Word long documents and then come back and look at options in Excel for linking and sharing data. You will see emails from us on these, but we hope to see you join us and continue to build on your professional development and your expertise with us. The other thing that will be helpful is that when we wrap up the webinar, there will be a short pop-up for a survey. I hope you will complete that to let us know what topics are helpful to you and how we can make this a really good educational and learning opportunity for you. I hope you found value out of our look at Microsoft Excel pivot tables. Let us know, how can we help you to be more productive? Please reach out to us for IT services and consulting to support you with Microsoft technologies. Thanks for joining us today. Hope to see you next month.